For almost 20 years, I have been deeply attached to this place at the corner of 2nd and Mulberry Streets. And I have taken for granted that Mulberry, like many of Evansville's oldest streets, is named for its trees: sycamore and locust and walnut and oak and gum and cherry and chestnut and mulberry. Now, I'm sure there are some of you, maybe many of you, who could identify all of those trees, including the mulberry tree. I couldn't myself pick out a mulberry tree. I do know that there's a favorite family story about my sister-in-law when she was about 5, sitting outside for hours playing under the mulberry tree in a white dress. The berries are notorious. So this odd little reference in this morning's lesson from the lectionary being read all over the world, this odd little reference to the mulberry tree brought up for me all these random thoughts along with the nursery rhyme and the Dr. Seuss book, and it sent me, of course, Googling mulberry trees. I found the stunning Van Gogh painting, which is reprinted on the cover of your program. You'll like it better in color when you Google it at home. And I found some good solid info from sites like the Purdue Extension Service. Red mulberry trees are native to the eastern US and can grow more than 70 feet tall. The white mulberry tree can get even bigger. It looks very similar. They're hard to distinguish. Silkworms eat nothing but the leaves of the white mulberry. So here in the US, as well as in Europe, the white mulberry tree was introduced from China long ago for silkworm production. The black mulberry is different. It's native to the Middle East. It's more of a shrub that grows to be about 30 feet high, and it can produce for hundreds of years. In October 1889, Vincent van Gogh painted the mulberry tree while in voluntary confinement at an asylum in Saint Remy, France. In a letter to his sister, he wrote, "As regards mulberry trees, there are a lot here. I painted one not long ago when its bushy foliage was a magnificent yellow against a very blue sky." Indeed, those are the dominant colors of the painting. Curator Lanier Graham of the Norton Simon Museum wrote, "As a celebration of the surging forces that pulsate through the universe, Van Gogh's The Mulberry Tree is one of the most powerful images of nature ever painted." Van Gogh transports this image from an ordinary tree to a stunning and powerful image of nature, glorious yellow against a blue sky on an October day. Well, whether the words evoke the mulberry tree of the Middle East continuing to produce nearly in perpetuity, or Van Gogh's glorious tribute to nature, the mulberry tree comes up today in the only mention of a mulberry tree in all of the New Testament. We may have heard in another gospel where Jesus talks about if you had faith the size of that teeny mustard seed, you could move mountains. And that phrase has found its way into common parlance. Moving mountains means doing big things, great things, overcoming enormous obstacles. But here Jesus says, if you had the faith of a mustard seed, you could command this mulberry tree to uproot itself and fly into the sea. Okay, but why would anyone want to do that? What does that have to do with the question? And it's actually not a question, but a request, a plea. Our little passage begins with the apostles saying to Jesus, "Increase our faith. Increase our faith, Jesus." This discipleship thing is hard. It's really hard. By chapter 17 of the Gospel of Luke, they're realizing that the bar is pretty high. After chapter 16, with high expectations around the shrewdness of faith and generosity to the poor, this next chapter starts with these little sayings from Jesus, first emphasizing that those who are strong in their faith have a responsibility to the weaker ones in faith. Indeed, he says, pretty much the worst thing you can do is to cause someone weaker in faith to stumble. And then he says, also, don't forget, if someone offends you, you should be prepared to forgive that person as much as 7 times in one day. And then they say, increase our faith. Well, I guess so. We have our own challenges in our life of faith. We have the same prayer many times, increase our faith. And then Jesus says, if you had the faith of a mustard seed, you could uproot this mulberry tree. Jesus, increase our faith. We face so much. We love you. We believe. We're committed. We're trying. But it's a lot. Forgiveness is hard. And there's so much pain and suffering that don't make sense. Increase our faith. Could Jesus really be saying, well, if only your faith was the size of a mustard seed, you'd be sending mulberry trees flying around. Wouldn't that be cool? There is a common view that if we only had enough faith, we would be able to defy the laws of nature, implied by flying mulberry trees around. We'd be able to erase incurable diseases and keep our loved ones free from suffering and dying with cancer. We'd be able to magically intervene before another cop kills an unarmed black person. We'd be able to uproot those Syrian children from the hell in which they're living and keep them safe. We know it doesn't work like that. So is Jesus being facetious? Absurd? Maybe it's an absurdity, as if to say, you're asking the wrong thing. Quantifying your faith is not the way to think about it. And it's true, when we focus on quantity of faith, we can end up with some absurd conclusions. A sentence that begins with, if I only had more faith, probably ends with a less than helpful conclusion, or maybe even a magical thinking one. We've all heard that in the face of a serious struggle or a terrible illness. If we pray enough, if enough people pray, if we can get on enough different church prayer lists, then surely she'll get well. Presbyterian minister and Elon University religion professor Rebecca Todd Peters reflected in her blog this week on the magical thinking of her childhood faith and the teaching of so much popular Christianity. She writes, asking God to heal the sick or feed the hungry or to end injustice is to imagine a divine being who is like a fairy godmother with the power to grant our various wishes if only we are humble and deserving enough. If what I ask God to do doesn't happen, the implication is that I am somehow not worthy and that God has chosen not to grant my wish. Or that I am worthy, but God is capricious and simply chooses not to grant my wish. Or that God is too busy to be bothered by my meager life and desires. She continues, perhaps the most dangerous is the belief that if I do get what I want, then it is a reflection that I have been blessed by God. The flip side of that belief is that those who do not have their prayers so answered are not blessed by God. Rebecca Todd Peters says, one way I have heard this conundrum parsed is to resort to the platitude that God answers all our prayers, but sometimes the answer is no. In all of these scenarios, she concludes, the image of God is deeply unsettling. A capricious being, one who plays favorites, one who could act but chooses not to. That's what flying mulberry trees makes me think about. Maybe Jesus is suggesting that to focus on an increase of faith is to try to figure out how to manipulate and manage the God juice, and that it doesn't work that way. So the disciples are saying we need to be the kind of leaders that can make things happen, that can have bottomless forgiveness and over-the-top generosity, and while we're at it, bring peace and justice and mercy and healing. And to that, Jesus seems to say, sure, start flying mulberry trees around. Maybe the point is to stop looking at the quantity and asking if only, but we don't know. As usual, Jesus doesn't explain. Instead, he goes directly on to talk about something else. There we are with that image of a great big mulberry tree pulled up, roots and all, and sailing towards the Ohio River when Jesus says, "Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from work, 'Come sit down at the table and be served'?" In other words, you don't thank your workers for doing what they're supposed to do, and when you've done all you're asked to do, you say, "We've only done what we ought to have done." The slavery language and the master-slave analogy is troubling and maybe too distracting to be helpful to our ears. I think here it's just meant to describe the household servant arrangement in the time of Jesus. So for our purposes, he seems to be calling their attention to household servants who do their job, and so by implication, fulfill their role. He says no master would say to the servant, "Here, come sit at the head of the table and take over my job." No, servants do their job, masters do their job. And you, Jesus says, when you do what God asks you to do, you say, "We are lowly slaves of our master." In other words, we're only doing what God expects. In this very cryptic and metaphoric text, maybe Jesus is saying, don't worry about the amount of faith you have. It's not an if-then proposition where bigger means better. Instead, live your life, do your job, play the role that you're called to play, whether it's plowing fields or making dinner, tending children or managing money, practicing law or building houses. Do what God expects of you in the roles you're called to play. Seek not to have it said of you, "Wow, she must have a huge amount of faith. Look at all that cool stuff she can do. Did you see that mulberry tree?" But rather be the one who says, "I am nothing without God who strengthens me." Psalm number 1 says that a person with faith in God is like a tree with deep roots planted by streams of water. Maybe Jesus is saying, don't be a flying tree, be a planted tree that doesn't move for 60, 80, 100 years, doing what needs to be done in the daily life of discipleship and facing what needs to be faced, whether it's cancer or racial profiling, whether it's the opportunity for generosity or the challenge of forgiveness. I want to come back to this minister and scholar, Rebecca Todd Peters. The article I quoted was written this week in the wake of her 51-year-old sister's diagnosis with stage 3 ovarian cancer. Rebecca Todd Peters confesses to that horrible feeling that no amount of faith, let alone professional religious training, can ever take away. She says that she has felt herself long for that old faith from her childhood that's so easy to fall back on, that if we all just pray hard enough, then somehow this nightmare will go away. She confesses again that she wishes it worked that way. But these fairy godmother images of God and prayer and faith are those I have found necessary to reject, she says. And so I am left standing with my sister on that precipice, gazing into the abyss. Our faith for healing is in the hands of the doctors and others who take care of her, she says. Our faith in family is that we will be there with and for her and each other. And our faith in God is knowing that we are not alone as we look into the abyss. God is a sacred power in the world beyond our comprehension and control, not a genie, not a fairy godmother, not a benevolent Father Sky Lord who does or doesn't take care of us. I read her beautiful words and I thought of Van Gogh's Mulberry Tree. We might say that this woman and her family are planting themselves like trees by the water, reaching down to the roots of their faith that God will be with them and give them strength for wherever this journey goes. We might say that she is choosing to live into her role, and her role is not to play God or to manipulate God, but to be the best sister she can be. And so she says, I will go with my sister, to hold her hand as she takes her chemo, to tell stories and share memories together, to laugh and to cry and to hold one another in our fragility and our brokenness and our fear. And we will not be alone. Our story imagines the master at the head of the table around which we all gather, and that is the one who calls us to do what we have to do, to face what we have to face, to be who we're called to be, but who also promises to be our bottomless source of strength and courage and grace and blessing. Choosing to follow Jesus is a challenging path. Most days, discipleship is the ordinary, extraordinary tasks of forgiving those we love, trying to step outside ourselves and walk in somebody else's shoes, saying some word or taking some small gesture toward a world of greater justice, deeper mercy, and expanding love, especially in these dangerous times. It's easy to despair or to fantasize about magical solutions like flying trees. But instead of wishing for dazzling faith, we're invited to plant ourselves like colorful trees against a fall sky, and to dig into the lives we've been called to, and of course to come again to the table as servants of the one who sits at the head and promises that here we will be fed. Amen.